Most of the registrations we have got are from Africa only. So maybe it's a little bit of confusion in terms of time zone. So we can wait for another minute or so. Let's see. And but to all the panelists, I would just want to inform you that we are live streaming this event as well on multiple platforms. It's LinkedIn or Facebook or like Twitter or something. Yeah. So, but mainly LinkedIn. So we get multiple views and multiple participants out there. Right. So while we, no, while other participants join, so I should just, start it off if it is okay with everyone.
Yeah. Yeah.
All right. So basically, yes. So thanks for joining once again. And yes, so this is part of our monthly webinar series that we do every month, focusing on one key and niche issue related to energy access and issues around that in India and Africa. So far, we have done 3 webinars, basically focusing on India, but this is the first in the series focusing on Sub-Saharan Africa. So yes, and we are Center for Science and Environment. Basically, Center for Science and Environment is a non-profit, not-for-profit organization based out of Delhi in India. And founded in 1980, we have been playing a really active kind of role in keeping tab and a watchdog kind of role in overall development in the umbrella domain of climate change, energy, and environment. We have multiple teams working across domains like food, agriculture, environment, industry, waste, and other areas of work. And we, my colleague and myself, beneath us here, we represent renewable energy team here. And so basically, we have been working on multiple issues. In India, we are focusing mainly on DRE and energy access issues. Similarly, for Africa as well, our focus is on energy access. So we did a cover story for our flagship fortnightly magazine, which is called Down to Earth, which I hope everybody is aware of, on Africa, energy access in Africa. And there was some shocking revolution that we came across, and that is where the idea came from to have a further deliberation on the very issue of energy access in Sub-Saharan Africa. So an overview or presentation will be provided by Beneath going forward, as to how the energy space, energy access space in Sub-Saharan Africa looks like. But just to give you the context, basically, there is an UN report, latest UN report, and our analysis also, we have been able to kind of, conclude that, uh, the state of energy access in Sub-Saharan Africa is really abject, and it's highly, poverty ridden, energy poverty ridden, to say. And if just to put the things and numbers in perspective, uh, average, per capita consumption, if you look at it, it's 110 units, although some reports say 200 units, but at household level, because per capita is inclusive of everything, energy for industry, services, and other things. But household level information, if you look at it, in an average scenario, it basically is not a very good picture that comes out. As compared to India, it is just 1/5 of the power that average household in Sub-Saharan Africa is consuming. In the average scenario, but in the really highly poverty-ridden scenario, it is even less. It's 1/12. So basically, what I mean to say is, uh, you know, on an average, zero point 0.5 to zero point 0.6 units a day power is available for a house, and to consume, which actually means in terms of appliances, the family has to make a really hard choice of using, let's say, 2 light bulbs of 12 watt each, for for 4 hours and maybe a ceiling fan of 60 watts for 4 hours. This is the average scenario. But if you talk about the worst case scenario, the really abject state of energy poverty, it is really, it boils down to using, being able to just use one bulb of 10, 12 volt, for just 1 hour a day. So that is the kind of scenario we are kind of trying to understand here. And my fellow panelists and colleagues will also agree that maybe, there may be some, deviations in the interpretation here and there, but I think more or less the overall scenario remains very, concern worthy, I would say. So I will not take much of your time, and I'll quickly basically introduce the panelists that are here today who will be providing their insights on the overall state of energy access in Sub-Saharan Africa, uh, followed by uh, uh, my colleague Beneath, who would be basically giving an overview of the overall energy access scenario and how renewables can play a decisive role in making energy access a reality in Africa. So we have Mr. Sahele Kede from he is the program manager who looks after energy access and transitions and works for the African Climate Foundation in South Africa. We have Mr. Meeksha Singh, uh, who is the specialist in strategy planning, works with International Solar Alliance. And we have Mr. Olu Aruike, he's the country director of Nigeria Has Power Systems. So with this, I would request my colleague, Mr. Beneath, to to basically provide an overview of the overall scenario in Africa, and followed by the speakers and the panelists, team panelists that we have, uh, uh, and the deliberations thereafter. So over to you, Vinny.
Thank you, Jay. Thank you for quickly setting the context of today's webinar. Uh, just to begin with, let me share my screen. Let me share my presentation. Just let me know once you.
Yeah, we can all see it.
Okay. We like as Jay had already mentioned about the object scenario of Africa. So today Africa stands at the crossroad of demographic dynamisms and economic potential, with 1 out of 3 people born today being African. The continent host of one of the fastest growing and young populations. So 3 of the top 10 economies are experiencing rapid economic growth, suggesting a promising future. However, this growth hasn't consistently translated into improved living standard for the significant portions of the populations. Uh, but despite all this progress, nearly 40% of people in sub-Saharan Africa still live in extreme poverty, and wealth inequality has also worsened over the time. So in 2019, the wealthiest 10% of the African populations are a staggering 70% of the continent's wealth. So it is contributing to the increasing disparity within the countries and between the countries. So this inequality are further compounded by we know with climate related challenges, leading to migrations within the continent and the other parts of the world. Uh, so this narrative of economic growth and the demographic vitality extends to the development of Africa's energy system. So while the continent with the nearly 18% of the world populations has seen imperative economic growth, its share a global energy consumptions, its share in global energy consumptions is disproportionately low, representing less than 6%. So despite the overall growth in energy demand, which is from 2010 to 2019 was 2.4%, the use of electricity has been slow has been slow to increase. So it is growing by only 2.3%. So we can see the contrast here during the same period. So this growth, rate, the growth rate lags significantly behind other developing countries. So access to electricity and clean cooking also remains a severe shortfall, in particularly in sub-Saharan region. About 43% of the total populations in Africa lacks access to electricity, and approximately 40% of 40% lacks access to clean cooking, concentrated mainly in sub-Saharan Africa. So in the global context, we can see that 675 million people are still without access of electricity, and 2.3 billion lack access to clean cooking. So it is 2020, as per 2022. So however, the share of the global populations with access to electricity increased from 83% in 2010 to 90% in 2021, which enabling more than billion people to access to gain the access during this particular period. So here we can see, as per the data from World Bank and various other sources, based on the indicators, World Bank indicators, that is regulatory indicators for sustainable energy rise, defines the basic household subsistence level of annual per capacity electricity consumptions is 360 kilowatt hour. So the object of the energy poverty in sub-Saharan Africa becomes apparent within these considerations of this particular benchmark analysis. An analysis for the year of 2021 reveals that more than 60% of this continent populations faces acute energy poverty. Approximately 38 countries globally failed to provide basic electricity. So this, out of this 38 countries, we have 30 countries from sub-Saharan Africa. So we can see from this chart, with an average per capita electricity consumptions at just 118 kilowatt hour. So this consumptions levels varies from 17 kilowatt hour to 333 kilowatt hour. So we can imagine, or we can see here, the sub-Saharan Africa's this challenge is particularly acute. So with 30 countries out of 38 countries falling from this particular region, the average per capita electricity consumptions of this country is just 110 kilowatt hour, which is daily just 1/4 of unit of electricity per person. So in conclusions, the reference of 360 kilowatt hour serves a crucial metric revealing the stark realities of energy poverties in Africa, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa. In this particular slide, we can see the energy mix of Africa and sub-Saharan Africa. Africa is having a lowest electricity footprint in the world right now. However, optimistic development scenarios, as per IEA, predicts its energy demand to expand significantly by 70% by 2030 due to its growing populations and the need of residential and industrial growth. But the current state of Africa's energy mix in this particular pie charts indicates significant reliance on coal and other fossil fuels. Nearly, we can see around 3/4 of the entire demand is made through these fuels. Whereas in sub-Saharan Africa, the picture is slightly different. They have more share of hydro and solar. So a staggering 64% of Africans primarily rely on gathered forest wood, agricultural activities, and animal waste as their primary sources of fossil fuel. Going to the next slide, this is a chart. This is a graph of the huge potential that we do have in sub-Saharan Africa and in the African continent. The chart indicates a massive renewable energy potential of around roughly of up to 9,000 gigawatt with about 60% concentrated in the Sub-Saharan region. So solar potential accounts for about 80,000 gigawatt, despite vast renewable energy potential realizations is minimal of just 2.6% of the total estimated potential just being tapped. Sub-Saharan Africa also echoes the similar trend. So here the assumption is based on the 1% of the land utilizations for solar and wind. The current renewable energy installed capacity in overall Africa and Sub-Saharan African regions form around 9% and 12% of the total installed capacity, respectively, for Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa. However, we can see here solar PV emerge as the most preferred RE technology options, followed by onshore wind, together accounting for about 84% of the total installed RE capacity. So wind and solar both present huge opportunities to reduce the eventually eliminates energy poverty in India, as the current realizations level is just 0.15% of solar and 1.7% of offshore wind. So the current per capita consumptions and the targeted benchmark of 360 kilowatt hour, there is a gap of 250 kilowatt hour that need to be addressed. So this necessitates an additional 300 gigawatt of solar energy or approximately 140 gigawatt of wind energy. Now, considering the grid quality and the infrastructure available over there, it is advisable for the Sub-Saharan African region to focus more on the decentralized mode of generations like tail end or off-grid solutions. Looking at the various challenges, Africa's energy transitions is at a critical juncture. While political willingness is evident that the NDCs submitted by the African countries, limited access of technology options like lack of affordable finance, limited international investments, reliance on fossil fuel-based energy sources, high power cost, and the unclear policy directions, which are some of the barriers. So in conclusions, we can say the formidable challenge currently, challenge of the energy access in Sub-Saharan Africa needs immediate and concerned efforts from the various stakeholders. The severity, we can see the energy poverty that is coupled with demography and the economic dynamics demand urgent policy reforms and the international collaborations as well. So it is very crucial to learn from the experience of others, leverage vast renewable energy potential that we have in Sub-Saharan Africa, and implement robust policies which can implement, or we can easily implement in Africa's unique conditions. So learning from the experience that we have from the emerging economies like India, China, Brazil, or some other countries from the Western world, which have successfully transitions to renewable energy. So these countries have not only significantly raised the access of electricity, but also demonstrated the sustained economic growth based on the renewable energy. While their journey took around 30 odd years, so Africa can't afford to enjoy the privilege of this 30 years time. Now the clock is ticking, and Africa must expedite its energy transition. Thank you.
Thanks, Vineet. Thanks, for giving the perspective. And just, one more thing, I wanted to add here. You have made it very clear, and it is very clear from the presentation that there exists a severe disparity. But if we, look at different parts of Africa and continent, there is also a wide gap. If you look at the northern African countries, per capita consumption is around 1,500 units a year. But if you look at, South Africa, it is almost 4,000, or even above 4,000 units a year. But when it comes to Sub-Saharan Africa, it is just 200. So the gap is too wide.
Yes, yes.
And yes, that is why, even the multilateral and so many agencies are kind of continuously emphasizing on uh, uh, decentralized generation and consumption of electricity through renewable means.
Right.
As the UN report also says, and the IEA report also says, and we are also of the same opinion. We that this probably is the road ahead, but we'll definitely, we want to hear more from the professionals and the experts, those are working in that particular area, and specifically working on that region. So we have our esteemed panelist, Mr. Sahil Kede from the African Climate Foundation. I apologize for my pronunciation of your name, Mr. Sahil. So yeah, hope you forgive me.
You
And
did it
he's
right, Jay.
okay, thank you. And so he's the program manager, and he's looking after energy access and transition work at the African Climate Foundation. So, Mr. Sahil, over to you, and we look forward to really, having a great insights from you on the very topic. Thank you.
Thanks, Jay,
So,
for the introduction.
yeah.
And
So, Mr.
Binit,
Sahil, will you
can you?
be sharing the presentations or should I?
Yes, you please do it from your end.
Yes,
My connection is a little bit unstable, so it's better that way.
no problem. Let me just quickly do that. Please let me know once it's visible.
Okay, now it's okay. Can you put it on presentation mode?
Yeah.
Okay, thanks, Binit. Next page. Okay, thanks again, Jinit and Binit, for this opportunity to interact with you and your audience on this very pertinent and timely topic. We have already put the scene in terms of what the current situation looks like in Sub-Saharan Africa, particularly in terms of energy access. Let me put in also, chip in with my own observations here. I'm more focused on the energy transitions, but naturally, in the African context, transitions would normally mean basically building out of the energy system from scratch. When you said energy transitions, normally you would be imagining one system transitioning from a fossil fuel-based one into a renewable energy and clean one. But in the case of the bulk of Sub-Saharan Africa, that's not the case. So where are we? In addition to what we have already heard from Jay and Binit, there is within the Sub-Saharan Africa region only about 80 gigawatts of installed power capacity, which is just to give you a comparison, about 4 times lower than India's with the comparative sizes of population.
One fifth, yes, one fifth, right.
1/5, so a fifth of, so not even a fourth, but a fifth of India. So no wonder we saw from Binit's presentation that per capita consumption is only 110 kilowatt hour per capita in Sub-Saharan Africa. Half the population, very roughly speaking, does not have access to electricity. I saw from Binit's presentation about 40% don't have clean cooking in Africa, but in Sub-Saharan Africa in particular, IEA says more than 70% actually do not have access to clean cooking. So all this means also very low level of industrialization, very poor and weak transport services. And most of Africa is still stuck with household sectors that are reliant on traditional biomass as sources of energy. Next slide, Vinit. Okay. So when we talk about transition, energy transition in Africa, what does that actually mean within the Sub-Saharan African context? So it means less about immediate transition from a fossil fuel-based system to a renewable energy-based system, but it means more about how to rapidly expand and strengthen the grid, how to radically scale power generation, how to ensure energy access for all, and all while achieving reliability, resiliency, affordability, and climate compatibility while doing all this. I will come a little bit into detail about many of these things in the next few slides. Next minute. So these are data taken from IEA's recent publication Energy Outlook. So for Africa to achieve its energy and climate goals between now and 2030, one needs to double the amount of investment per year that flows into its energy systems. So currently, in 2022, the figure was around 90 billion USD per year, with 2/3 of that going into fossil fuel, and only 1/3 going into renewable energy or clean energy. That needs to double into something like 190 billion each year by 2030, and 2/3 of that going into clean energy this time around. And this includes some 25 billion USD needs to go into universal access programs. Currently, we are only managing around 15% of that. Some 3 billions are being spent in terms of improving and scaling universal access currently, but that needs to rise to by some 8 times. In other ways, if we don't this financing to around 25 billion, that would mean many African countries will reach universal access only towards the end of this century, 8 times longer. It will take them 8 times longer. So that 80 gigawatts installed capacity you have seen needs to triple between now and 2030. And investment also is needed in small scale projects, as already been rightly pointed out. At least a large chunk, if not most, of universal access in rural areas, in rural settings, will probably come from small scale mini grids and standalone system projects. So this paradigm also means that there will be a lot of small scale projects, often in remote rural areas, often serving customers who have very low income. So this is a picture that we need to consider going forward. Next slide, please. Okay, so, but there are also other exogenous and endogenous situations that are impacting the situation in Sub-Saharan Africa overall. First, growth has been actually very strong in Sub-Saharan Africa for quite a while, especially the 2010s. But beginning towards the end of the 2010s, and definitely after the onsetting of the COVID pandemic, growth has slowed down significantly. And with the war in Ukraine, supply chain disruptions, that all led into energy crisis, high inflation, and interest rate rises have significantly affected Sub-Saharan Africa also. It has implication in terms of restrictive global financing conditions, weak investment, which means achieving development and climate goals are more difficult. And it has all burdened also many governments and states with high levels of debt service. So particularly debt restructuring is a very critical element if we want to ensure sustainable development and climate goals by 2030. Next slide, please. So many Sub-Saharan Africa countries are in high-risk investment situation. This is internally there is very few, or let me say, underdeveloped or non-existent capital markets. So they cannot rely on raising local finances for many of their projects. They have weak legal and regulatory systems, and their institutions also are weak in terms of implementing capacities. There are around 54 countries in Africa, 55 countries actually in Africa, with a similar kind of population size to India, that is a single country. So this has meant that the continent is burdened with small and fragmented energy markets, which are quite often very difficult to service at appropriate capital cost. Debt distress and deteriorating sovereign credit rating means many countries have lost access to global capital markets. Recent studies have shown actually that a third of about a third of African countries, a little more than 20 countries, are either at a very high risk of, or already in debt distress situation. So they have very little chance to raise capital for their development. And many of the countries on the continent are actually post-conflict or fragile countries. And the African Development Bank actually has determined that close to nearly 2 dozen African countries fit this classification, which means in addition to everything else, there is also an associated political as well as reputational risk in doing business in these countries. Next slide, please. So what does this all mean? Borrowing costs have reached unsustainable levels. In many countries, the debt servicing costs are twice the clean energy investment levels. And mind you, between now and 2030, we need to triple. We need to double the general investment flows. But African countries, for them to play their own part in this, they need to get some relief from debt servicing, because it is simply taking away too much of the finances available to countries. The cost of the capital of utility scale clean energy generation is also extremely high in Africa. 2 to 3 times that's an average figure again taken from IEA, but in some particular countries it could reach more than 5 times the capital cost of investing in terms compared to advanced economies and China. So this actually, even if the continent has, as we have seen from Bennett's presentation, one of probably the largest solar potential in the world and one of the largest wind potentials, developing them will not be easy. It will be very costly because of the cost of capital in doing business in Africa. So all this translates into a very serious risk of missing the achievement of the sustainable development goals, not just for energy, but for all other sustainable development goals by 2030, as well as climate targets. And mind you, this decade is a very critical decade when it comes to the world having any chance of attaining 1.5 degree, maximum of 1.5 degrees change. Next slide, please. Okay. So the international community and development partners need to recognize this specific context of Africa. So the finance needs to be radically scaled. The global finance architecture needs also to reflect current reality. Especially currently, there is a lot of initiative going on around here. The multilateral development banks, and I mean, they will have to reconsider how they do business, how their lending processes and capacities look like. So there is already this Bridgetown initiative that's trying to address this. So this will be one of the most important topics probably to be covered during the upcoming COP28 meeting convention in Dubai. Concessional finance needs to be scaled. For many countries, grants are very acutely needed because they cannot raise any other forms of finance. So grants will be playing a key role to fund access programs, because normally access programs are related to poor rural households that cannot be financed using commercial resources. And also grants will be needed for early stage financing for entrepreneurs invested in local entrepreneurs invested in clean and renewable energy resources, especially the distributed renewable energy and the mini grid space. We need a lot of innovative financing that will help to leverage private finance. There is a lot of talk of blended finance, asset refinancing, brownfield finance. There is a long list of potential innovative financing that is being piloted in many geographies, but once the success is confirmed, it needs to be scaled across the Sub-Saharan Africa region in general. And of course, there will be a need for stable regulatory environment. More about it on the next slide, please. So yeah, African countries will now have to take ownership of the enabling policies and the creating of the necessary environment within their context. So what they need to address technical, financial, institutional, and political issues, barriers, challenges, roles and responsibilities for the public and private sector need to be defined. Business environment in general needs to be improved. Contracts need to be firmly respected. Effective and the energy access, universal energy access, and the relevant climate goals need to be effectively linked. There will be a need to move away from a project focus to a programmatic focus on development outcomes. So yeah, we need to focus on energy access, rate of industrialization, poverty reduction, and the likes. And we need always to have equity and inclusivity to make sure that no African is left behind in this surge toward this universal access and achievement of climate goals. And most countries on the continent will have to keep on strengthening their internal capacity and building out the basic infrastructure that is needed for the delivery of many of these services we are talking about. Next slide, please. Benit, next slide. Okay. So I will end by saying that the energy transition actually is as much an opportunity as a challenge. Actually, it is more of we can look at that if under the right conditions, we can look at it as more of an opportunity than a challenge, because it opens a new paradigm for development for Africa. The fossil fuel era of the 20th century have basically skipped Africa. Africa has not managed to develop and industrialize during that period. So this is now a new window of opportunity open to it. It has ample resources of renewable energy and ample resources of critical minerals that are important for the energy transition, for the global transition. So it can use these resources to industrialize and participate in the global value chain in these emerging industries. So most Africans actually recognize this opportunity. The low carbon transition actually offers historically, and its partners now must support Africa's vision for its energy system future and what it will take to achieve them. Thanks very much, and that's the end of my presentation. Over to you.
Thank you, Sahil. Thank you so much for such insightful thoughts. As you had mentioned right in the beginning, saying that energy transition in Africa is not just about switching, or fuels, from one fuel to the other, but it actually requires, holistic and all-round development on all fronts, and that need has been in emphasis at various forums for quite some time, and even the recently concluded Africa Climate Summit echoed the same sentiment, saying that Africa, particularly SSA, needs all-round support in terms of financing and reforms around that, in terms of technology transfer and everything to develop the entire ecosystem. Because as of now, the ecosystem exists to very limited extent, or maybe in some countries it doesn't exist at all. So yes, that is a very grim scenario, and thanks for the insight that you provided to us. Some new thoughts, some fresh perspectives, and thank you so much for being here. And I'm sorry, I forgot to basically introduce you to the audience, in terms of your brief bio. So let me just kind of give a brief introduction of Mr. Sahele, and he's the Energy Access and Transition Program at Africa Climate Foundation, which is the first African-led strategic climate change grant-making foundation on the continent that works to identify strategic opportunities to support adaptation, resilience, and mitigation initiatives, and to unlock new opportunities for sustainable development in Africa. And before joining SCF, he was a senior power engineer at the African Development Bank's Ethiopia office, where he managed the bank's energy portfolio of projects in Ethiopia and worked on structuring of new energy projects and provided technical support and policy in the energy sector and other areas relevant to energy, environment, and climate change. He was also the Director for Energy Study and Development at the Ministry of Water, Irrigation, and Energy of Ethiopia, where he was responsible for national initiatives concerning energy sector policy, strategy, and program formulation, initiatives shaped by climate resilient green economy development strategy and the need to secure access to sustainable energy for all. He had also worked at the National Electricity Regulator and the National Electricity Utility in Ethiopia in various capacities. He is an electrical engineer by training. So thanks, Mr. Sahile, for being here. Now, I'd like to invite Ms. Tamiksha Singh. She is the strategy planning specialist, International Solar Alliance, in Gurugram, India. Just to give a brief bio of Ms. Tamiksha, she comes with an interdisciplinary background and around 11 years of experience working on strategic research and analysis, public policy and mechanism for enabling climate finance. At ISA, Tamiksha is coordinating the various programs and their delivery. Previously, Tamiksha has worked with GIZ, where she was seconded to the Ministry of Environment, Forest and Climate Change, with the World Resource Institute India as manager for the climate resilience practice, and at the Energy and Resource Institute, TERI, focusing on climate policy and finance. So Tamiksha has an MBA degree in finance from Nirma University, Ahmedabad, and she is an MSc in Sustainable Development from HGC Paris. So, Mr. Tamiksha, welcome and over to you.
Thank you very much, Jay. Vineet, can I request you to please play my presentation?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's visible. Thank you. So just to start, I'll just tell a little bit in case about International Solar Alliance. The International Solar Alliance was launched in 2015. And today we are at 116 signatory countries with around 94 members. These include over 30 ratified members from the African region. And there are, if we count even the signatories, then the number is close to 40. So Africa has been a place where we focused a lot of the work. It's got a huge potential for solar, as we've already heard in the first presentation and Beneath's context setting also. So I won't go too much into details in that, but just to let everyone know that Africa has been a focus of ISA in the work it's been doing. And we've especially been looking a lot at DRE solutions and mini grids, solar mini grids. So that's where I'm coming from. We had a recent report that was launched at the G20 energy meetings in July. This was called the Roadmap of Solar Energy for Universal Energy Access. And most of what I'm saying today is based from that. So Vineet, if you could go to the next slide, please. So we've already seen some of the numbers. We know the population that lacks access to electricity, despite Africa having 40% of the globe's potential for solar power, it still has just around 2% of capacity of solar power generation. The points that I wanted to emphasize were that ISA found in its study that out of 200 billion that was invested in solar sector globally in 2021, less than 5% was actually invested in Africa. And that's despite its huge potential, despite the huge energy gap. And that really points to an area why we need to focus on this, why it's such a critical issue. Another point is that 1 trillion is what is required for emerging and developing economies. But as Mr. Sahile was saying, it's close to 190 billion, what's needed to meet the 2030 goals immediately. So that's, I think, a more workable target, but still like far out of reach. So when you see these things, it does seem like finance is the missing link, and that is what's required. But what is stopping finance? Why, when the potential is there, the opportunities are there, why is it that this is not happening? So so finance becomes a small piece of the puzzle. There are other factors which are also affecting it. we've been talking about that, enabling environment, regulations, the capacity, technical capacity, and also human power, like skilled manpower to be able to install and operate and maintain the systems. So these are the gaps that are there. But yeah, so we can go to the next slide. So these are the gaps that are there. The first three are what we've been speaking on. The points that I want to really emphasize on from terms of why the financing is missing are the last 3 points. There's a mismatch between consumer affordability and suppliers' financial viability. Now, the reason for that is that most of the, when you think of the DREs units that are required, they are in the remote areas, which are far from the grid already. They are rural populations. They might have smaller pockets of populations numbers. So in those areas, it becomes, anyways, the people who are there have very low paying capacity. So either they have heavily subsidized in electricity, or they don't have electricity and it's just an additional cost, or we have to find a way to make it something that they're able to pay. So a lot of thinking has to go into understanding what the payment mechanism for this could be, how we could work with the kind of money, the funds we have, the payments that are there, the finance mechanisms that are already in place, maybe in the national budgets or from international climate finance sources, and find ways to make this something that can be that can lead to affordable energy for these pockets of the population. Also, it's important. Another point that I need to make is that DRE really makes sense. What our report found is that once, if a pocket of population is around 10 kilometers or an average 15 to 20 kilometers away from the existing grid, then to be able to quickly, 2030 is the target when we're supposed to reach universal energy access, and we're far from it. But to quickly be able to at least spread electricity to the people who are not still have access to it, DRE could be a thing, and that's why it should be a focus area. And pockets which are that far away, can DRE becomes more feasible cost-wise, instead of actually doing grid extensions, which requires large infrastructure and investment costs and a lot of other issues, which makes it really prohibitive at this stage. So that's the reason to focus on this. Besides that, the second last point that's there is the non-cost reflective tariffs, with mini-grid tariffs being often bound to on-grid tariffs by regulations. So this is one thing that we've been finding that makes business models in this area really not be able to become feasible on just like pure commercial basis, and why they need some kind of extra support. Because in several regulations, the government, in the spirit of actually making energy affordable for the people, have these fixed tariff amounts that are there. And the mini grids produce at a price that is much higher than this, just by the nature of the technology that's there and the kind of issues they have to deal with, being away from infrastructure, having the finding the right trained manpower to be able to operate these. So at the moment, the price that they are able to sell the power at is much higher than what the fixed amount is. So this is another barrier that needs to be think, and that is why new investments or new business models and project developers in this area are largely restricted. Finally, there's limited, like I've already mentioned, there's limited profitability or viability of business models in DRE, which is leading to a reduced pipeline of bankable projects, which is making it further difficult for investments to come in. Go to the next slide, please. So then the point is that what we need to enable DRE is either catalytic public funding or sustained private investments. And one issue is that right now DRE is still in energy policies, even in countries where electricity access is very limited, it is still considered to be a niche solution, something that's not really a mainstream thing and not integrated well into the national energy policies. So what the governments are working towards are not really focusing on DRE solutions, but that is for, like, you can say, ad hoc or stopgap kind of arrangements. So it's not properly mainstreamed into the policies. And that kind of a view makes it really makes it a challenge to actually get the right enabling policy and regulatory environment to be able to take this forward. So the one thing to understand first for the governments is to build the rationale and build a case of why it is an important technology, why it should be integrated into the national policies. So the 3 points that I have here, and there are several more, but just 3 key points is it improves, it can lead to a lot of, like it has multifold impacts. So like multiple impacts in other sustainable development areas, health, education services, agricultural resilience. I saw a point on the chat screens about how DRE can actually really help with irrigation, with storage of agricultural produce, and several other such activities, along with also electrifying health services and public schools, which will also have a multiple impact on development also. Second is building the national power system's resilience. Several times we find that there's only one source of energy that the entire national energy system is dependent on. And even if that's renewable energy, for example, say hydropower, which is the case in Ethiopia, Malawi, and Zambia, for example. But what happens is that because of climate impacts that we're already facing, the water levels are also varying. That leads to that kind of a fixed power source that they have also becoming variable. So diversifying an energy, the energy that's coming, the different electricity, the different sources of electricity in the energy mix is always important. And DRE, solar power DRE, and other renewable energy power DRE is a good way to do that. And finally, it improves livelihood opportunities and can also lead to several new revenue generating activities like micro enterprises at the rural area, in rural areas, as well as other activities which could be like tailoring, using mechanized machines. So those kind of opportunities can also come and lead to a much larger positive impacts of this one solution. So to enable this, what are some measures that are needed? These are some that I'm just suggesting is like, one is climate budget tagging or SDG budget tagging, because it's becoming so important to know what exactly the funds that are coming and where they are going. This could also help make a case to understand where the funds went, what the impacts finally were of that. It might improve transparency and reporting in that area and make this a more have a larger impact going forward. There's a need to develop an institutional capacity and strategy for RE at the local, at the national ministries for energy. So those kind of cells which have with technical assistance can be provided to, modeling exercises could be done for, so that could be integrated into every country system. There's a need to engage with and upskill local communities, because it's really important that we don't just go ahead and put the DRE solutions in a far-off community without first engaging with the community, understanding what they need, who will be the people operating it, how they can actually be partners in this kind of a solution, and really work with them towards that. So there is local buy-in. And also, this is a point actually that Jay raised last time we were talking about correctly targeting subsidies to enable the electricity. Like, do the subsidies always need to be at the end consumer level, or could they also, in such a situation, seeing that these kind of solutions are not taking up, even though they have so many impacts, could it be also at the producer level if it's properly worked out and targeted, so that the prices for the end consumers finally come down to a level they're able to pay? And I think that's something we should explore further. Go to the next slide, please, Vinay. So when I was talking about public finance, I meant the finance from national budgets as well as international climate and developmental finance. Now I'm talking about mobilizing investments in DRE. So this is about getting the private sector investments in. We need, and I'll just quickly go over these. So what basically is where we are right now, as Mr. Sahele was saying, the cost of capital is prohibitive. It is really because it's taking a lot of factors into account, which has nothing to do with really the project itself. For example, currency risk, political risk, sovereign risk, and a range of such factors, which really makes it very difficult for a small project developer to be able to get the funds they need at the cost that is actually viable. So these are things that a project developer at their level can't really address, because it's global issues like macroeconomic issues, but they end up being the brunt of it. So they need these kind of supports. One thing that we found in like ISA in its discussions has been seeing is that actually the cost, there's limited solar projects that are available in Africa, but the default rate for these is around 2%. So that's actually a very small amount if you see. So if a solar investment is able to be deployed properly, the risk of a project developer actually defaulting is not that high as you would imagine once you see the cost of capital. So keeping that in mind, what is needed are mechanisms to facilitate access to affordable finance. And there are several of them. We've talked about blended finance vehicles and concessional loans, and even say carbon finance, which I believe is something that Africa last year announced it, African climate carbon credit market that they'll be creating. So that could have opportunities. And this is also an area where ISA has been working a lot over the last year. At the COP last year, we announced the Global Solar Facility. That is a blended finance vehicle again. It's got three types of mechanisms that are there. There's a payment guarantee mechanism, an insurance guarantee mechanism, and equity investments. So this is something we're in the process of designing, and we're hoping to launch it. It'll be launched first for the African region in its first edition, and then slowly it will be scaled up to other regions. So that is one. And then a pipeline of bankable projects. Like I was saying, there are very few private sector players, project developers that are there. So the pipeline of projects is very limited. So by chance, we are able to get an investment, large investment, is difficult for them to find projects to invest in. So for that also, it's important to develop an entrepreneur, like an ecosystem of startups and entrepreneurs in this area. And ISA did a recent exercise called the Solar X Startup Challenge. This was also announced last year. It went through a whole process where startups were invited to give in the applications. And we received 180 plus applications, which were far more, like we were expecting around 100, but there were 180 plus. So that just shows that there are, these are not all DRE applications in the solar sphere, but largely interconnected to DRE or can work with that. So this is 180 plus from 28 countries. And over a process, we've now reached down to 20 winners, which are from 10 different countries across different application areas. And these were announced in July. So we will be working with them and also doing a kind of bootstrapping exercises to help them be able to hone their finance facing capacity. The third is trained manpower for installing, operating, and maintaining the systems. This is again something that is critical after investment is done and a system is deployed. If the maintenance is not properly there, then these things just fail, and that has been an issue. So for this again, we have ISA has started an initiative called the STAR-C. So these are these centers that are established at the country level, which aim at providing technical trainings and capacity building exercises for different groups of target audience to do an entire ecosystem of capacity, trained capacity manpower being available. Then there's a need to build a local supportive ecosystem for DRE units by engaging the local communities. This is something also which could be critical for making sure that a system is successful in the long run versus failing almost immediately after being deployed. From the government side, we've talked about requiring clear policy signals, facilitative measures such as feed-in tariffs, net metering, tax incentives and subsidies. And several organizations are working with the governments. And in fact, at the Africa Summit, the announcement also showed that this area was something that was recognized by the governments in Africa, and they all were going to work on it. And there will be hopefully a lot of movement in this area going forward. From private sector point also, there's a need to standardize administrative documents and streamline the procedures that are in place. Because in many cases, there are several layers of procedures that are required, several documents. It's not clear what's needed where. So kind of having a more systematic approach to this, or one stop where all the things can be found, so they can reduce the transaction costs of this part of it for our project developers is important. This is also an area which I just started exploring. We're trying to do regulatory assessments at country levels and also develop some tools which would help with this. And finally, there's a need to aggregate and standardize projects, because DRE by its very nature are small scale investments. At times when we have large investors like MDBs and all, they come with these big packages. So there's a need to kind of have a group of projects that together can be able to absorb that kind of investment and deliver to a certain standard. So yeah, that's what's needed. And next slide, please. So to finish, I just wanted to leave with a few positive indicators that we're already seeing, which would indicate that going forward, this is an area which will become much better and the challenges we're facing will improve. There's already been a significant shift from diesel to solar hybrid systems. It's already proven to be a more inexpensive and a more feasible model for rural communities and in Sub-Saharan Africa. So yeah, and the cost of capital has already halved since 2010, and it's continuing to fall because of the declining component costs. and the improved ecosystem around solar. So that is also going to have beneficial impacts. There's been a lot of interest recently in DRE solutions, especially solar mini grids for Sub-Saharan Africa by NDBs. And there have been several announcements of funds, facilities, technical assistance packages that have been announced. So going forward, there will be a lot of work in this area. And this is again an area which I hope to see a lot of progress in. And finally, digitalization of payment mechanisms. We're seeing that in all our countries and several of our transactions, innovative business models, which are just really being able to cut down the cost by digitalizing the mechanisms, are really making a big difference. And Africa has some of examples of being one of the early movers in this area and early adopters, and that could also be somehow integrated into the DRE models, and hopefully that will also make this more viable. So yes, that's it from my side. Thank you.
Thank you,
Thank you,
Tanisha. Yeah, it's a lot of information to absorb. Yes, and really nice to hear, and encouraging to hear all these positive things, that you just told about, about the ISA's role and its initiatives, in Sub-Saharan Africa, the startup movement, that has been created already, and it is already in motion. And it's a kind of all-round effort from ISA, I would say, and we must all commend ISA for this wonderful work. And yes, we all can see, the kind of transition that the energy transition that Africa has witnessed over the past, starting from the single standalone lamp, of 5 watt, 4 watt lamp, to microgrids and mini grids. And let's also look at this journey, to the mini grids, grid integration of many grids and microgrids, and so on and so forth going forward. But yes, there are certain lacunas and certain challenges in terms of lack of grid infrastructure and overall distribution system, generation and distribution system. But yes, energy access needs to be an outcome of all these efforts, and we must all laud and recommend or commend the efforts of ISA-like organizations who are providing unconditional support to all the entrepreneurs, the consumers, and everything. And one key takeaway from your talk is that as you rightly mentioned and address, is financing the missing link. Yes, this is the missing link, and probably ISA is working towards that. So let's be very positive. And with that note, I would like to introduce, after having heard the policy and regulatory and financing aspects of energy access in SSA, I know it would be interesting to understand the perspective of a developer, from the perspective of developing a project, delivering energy services to its people. I know, as we keep hearing, the consumers are not well enough, or they don't have enough money to pay for the energy services. But is it really the case? And what are the challenges that the developers are facing? As I mentioned, the transition we have seen from LAMP to mini grids and standalone systems and DRE. And also, what are the challenges that the developers have been facing, and how they look at the overall, opportunity going forward? So we have Mr. Olu Arulike from Husk Power System. He's the country head for Nigeria for Husk Power, and he also oversees additional markets in the region. So Mr. Olu is an experienced energy and finance professional, having successfully coordinated various work streams within the off-grid sector. He works also regularly, includes leading M&E efforts on existing renewable energy projects to measure impact and spur demand stimulation efforts wherever necessary. And in addition, he has led teams to ascertain the viability of potential renewable energy project sites, and has played key roles in driving sector stakeholder engagement of various collaborative efforts to ensure the sector achieves scale, while also contributing to various nursery workshops, thought pieces, and leading publication, in addition to being involved in attracting financing of over 10 million US dollars to various off-grid projects. He now leads the HUS Nigeria team in driving the company's ambitious growth plans, which is like 100 sites by the end of 2024 and 500 by 2026. Prior to HUS, He has also worked with two global banks as well as a female-led impact investor whose investments have cut across energy, fintech, e-mobility, and food processing. So, Mr. Olu, thank you so much for being here, and we all look forward to hearing more from you. And as you have mentioned, you have a very ambitious plan to go or to reach 100 sites by the end of 2024 and 500 by 2026. So there is definitely a collaboration and a collaborative opportunity with ISA, I would say, because both seem to be on the same boat. So over to you, Mr. Olu.
Yeah, thank you for having me today. I don't have much and I think much to say, but I think a lot has been already covered by Tamishka and Sahela. They've made my job quite easy today. But just to buttress on a lot of things they've been saying, and the things that we continue to see operating in this space, the challenge is huge, and that is something that we've all come to agree. There are over 680 million Africans or people living in Sub-Saharan Africa without access to reliable power or living even entirely off-grid, and that is a challenge. But that is a formidable challenge for us to deal with. Now commitments continue to be made, even the commitments for energy access by 2030, but we are still way off. I will just on my screen also permit me to share this brief presentation and slide. If you can see, please let me know.
Yeah, we can see it very clearly.
Right. Okay, great. So this is a map of Africa essentially, and you can see why some areas are lightly colored, others are not. The areas in the darker shades are mostly Sub-Saharan Africa, and you can just to quantify what the challenge is, why countries in the north of Africa and southern Africa look more electrified. Countries in Sub-Saharan Africa, from Mali down all the way to Namibia and Botswana, are faced with this challenge of electrification or poor electrification. And without much work to be done, without much being done over the next few years, that problem will continue to stick with Africa. It is a formidable challenge. The ecosystem continues to be fragmented. And, even finance commitments to Sub-Saharan Africa for energy access issues continue to be so little. But with things like the African Climate Summit that just happened a few weeks ago, Africa has now showed that it is now in a position to head on by itself, take on this challenge. And it has, I'm sure everybody knows quite a few commitments were made there, including Horsepower's commitment as a developer that has now been active across the continent in the last 5 to 8 years to commit to ensuring that we will build 2,500 mini grids across parts of Africa in the next 5 years. And we'll be able to attract, and we'll need to attract $500 million. That commitment is driven by the fact that in a place like Nigeria, for instance, where we are now operating for the last 3 years, we've been able to build a dozen locations, mini grids, and are serving thousands of people reliably. We've also seen that there is the opportunity when you have reliable and the right regulations, like in Nigeria's case, to be able to ensure that private sector investment or private sector players like ourselves are able to come into the country or into the region and be able to proceed to build out this mini grids. Why mini grids, somebody may ask. Mini grids have been said to be the lowest cost option or the least cost option to effectively and rapidly provide reliable power for people living in these areas. And it has been proven to work. Earlier this year, Husk announced its first has been the first profitable mini grid company in the world across primary markets in India and Nigeria. And that is because a lot of work has been done in there. That is also because there is now the approach of not just building out mini grids for power, but also leveraging reliable power to support things like irrigation, which I also heard before from one of the panelists, irrigation even things like e-mobility and how people get around, supporting cold storage, supporting agro-processing. That is the only way mini-grids have and will continue to prove sustainable. What is the next step now? The next step is that countries around Sub-Saharan Africa need to now look more closely to ensuring that mini-grids and interconnecting with the grid becomes critical parts of its policies and regulations for electrification. That intentionality is what we've seen in a country like Nigeria. That intentionality needs to happen across other Sub-Saharan African countries. So for mini grids and for interconnection with the grid to be able to thrive. And with that way, we will then be able to say we will be able to build the tens of thousands of mini grids that we need for people to, for our people to become electrified. With the current pace at where we're going, we will not be able to meet SDG 7 targets by 2030. But if we are able to quickly and intentionally, from government to other stakeholders, DFIs, development agencies, and agree to ensure that everything comes or every collaboration is with the intentionality levels that we need to be able to move quickly, then we can begin to say that the goal of being able to achieve electrification for people in Sub-Saharan Africa will be met. On my screen there, you see the number of mini grids that are required to ensure that electrification across Sub-Saharan Africa happens, but that is at no small cost. Billions of dollars will be required over the next few years to achieve this. We also need to ensure that the right type of financing is available. Mini grids are an infrastructure business, and that means they are long-tenured. They also require patient capital. And for this to happen, financiers need to understand and be able to come to the table, not just the development financiers, but local financing at the right rates, local financing that is patient and understand what needs to be done needs to also happen. Also, just to also touch on regulations, in our experience and using our experience in Nigeria, regulations we continue to say or continue to commend the Nigerian REA, the Rural Electrification Agency in Nigeria, and the regulator. They have ensured that the right regulations have been in place since 2016, 2017. And that is what has necessitated companies like Husk and other similar companies to come into the market to ensure that we are able to provide these mini grids and provide the right level of service. Other Africans or other Sub-Saharan Africans need to look at this model that has continued to work in Nigeria and begin to look at how they will adopt the same. The other things is like the African Continental Trade Agreement, things like that also has to be looked at because there are also supply chain challenges that need to be resolved. A lot of the components of some of the components that we need to electrify rural communities through mini grids are not readily available in Africa. And supply chain risk or shocks across the world, like we've seen last year with the Russia-Ukraine war, will continue to impact on how quickly we're able to move to deliver these mini grids and ensure that Sub-Saharan Africa is electrified and this challenge of non-electrification is overcome. So Africa needs to, or Sub-Saharan Africa, through the AU, through relevant bodies, through relevant stakeholders, need to look at activating or ensuring that the implementation of things like the African Free Continental Trade Agreement is implemented to the letter. And then I've also spoken about long-term financing that is local. The fact that, you know, the exchange rates FX impacts, and this is from also our experience in Nigeria, where, you know, we've also seen the currency also being devalued or over time. That impact is also something that Africa and Sub-Saharan African countries and relevant stakeholders need to look at. How do we continue to mitigate it? How do we continue to manage this? What are the processes for ensuring that long-term currency, long-term financing that is local currency is readily available for mini grid developers like ourselves, or even other actors in the space doing similar work to ensure that we are able to access that financing and be able to continue to deploy these grades. The other thing is that faster permitting is also required. This is an offshoot from policy and regulations. The implementation of those policy and regulations should be in such a way that they are quick, supportive, and readily able to be leveraged by actors like ourselves. I think this is all I had, but it is clear that Sub-Saharan Africa's challenge of non-electrification, one, can be solved by the use of mini grids. We've seen that in Nigeria and other parts of Sub-Saharan Africa. Now is the time to ensure that all stakeholders, all critical stakeholders, development finance agencies, development finance partners, development agencies, mini grid developers like ourselves, governments, are working together to ensure that we are no more just building one or two mini grids. We are now building mini grids at scale. That means we will need to deploy thousands of mini grids every year. And that also means that we will need the right sort of capital in billions of dollars to be able to ensure that that deployment happens. And that also means that the right equipment that we require to deploy these mini grids are readily available as required. And then other things would follow. Africa is the youngest continent in the world. We have the right labor resources, the right human resources to be able to ensure that this problem is solved. Now, we need the right mix of capital, the right regulations, and the right support from all relevant stakeholders to ensure that our commitments, which have been recently made at even the Africa Climate Summit, are achieved. And SDG 7 in the next 7 years, thinking of it, is ideally achieved within that time frame. Or if these things do not happen, then Africa will continue, or Sub-Saharan Africa will continue to be the challenge of non-electrification of over 600 million people. That is a very huge number. And with population growth, that it is scary that that number could even quadruple, could even double in the next 5 years if we do not continue to move quickly. I will stop here and I'll be happy to take questions, but it is clear what is required. The challenge is defined. What is required, it is also clear. It is now left for every principal actor and stakeholder to ensure that right action is given and right attention with intentionality is given to these challenges to ensure that we solve them. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Olu. Thank you for your perspectives. And really, it was really great to hear your thoughts, as to how the mini grid should be scaled up and what kind of support is required, especially in Sub-Saharan Africa, taking lessons from Nigeria, that can be replicated across the region. So definitely, there is a lot to deliberate on this particular subject. But yes, in the interest of time, we'll have one question specifically for Mr. Olu from a participant who is actually asking, is there a solar panel manufacturer industry in Nigeria and other African countries could benefit from? Or is there an employment program for the youth in solar industry? Or are the panels imported from other countries? So, Mr. Olu, if you may want to answer this.
Thank you for those questions. And yes, there are now there are panels locally, and with how the government is intentional with its commitments by regulation, by policy, there are now also plans to ensure that panel manufacturing companies are set up. That is in progress. And to your second question, I believe, was around the employment program. Now, the sector of, fortunately in Nigeria, like in India, which is a more advanced market, the sector is quite young. That means there are not a lot of people with the requisite knowledge. But companies that ourselves and other potential partners are looking at how to plug these gaps. by ensuring that either training, programming, transfer and knowledge transfer and things like that are beginning to happen. We're also looking to collaborate with schools that are in our local areas to ensure that they understand the right curriculum that is required and the right training that is required for their students to be able to join companies like ours. Essentially, ensuring that we are creating a pool and a pipeline for people to come through into the sector. With nascent sectors, it is really, really unattractive in the offset, and we are seeing those challenges as well. But with sort of like catch them young kind of programs, which we are now looking to universities and other institutions to work with, we believe that is the right way we can create a pool for young people to be interested in the sector firstly, and then to aspire to work and help us solve the challenge that we continue to face with electrification.
Okay, yeah, thank you so much. So just to understand a little more, and because we are already kind of towards the end of this, one question I would like to basically take to all the panelists, which is kind of has been occurring to my mind ever since I heard Mr. Sahere, who basically said that the basic challenge in finance in all the African countries, across African countries, is that the cost of debt servicing, the finance required to service debt is more, twice as much than the real investment in renewable energy projects. And we also hear that the much needed climate finance through global, as part of the global commitment, is yet to come to Africa, right? So I just wanted to understand the link, as to how this much needed or much required climate finance through global commitments is going to help kind of advancing that particular area in terms of scaling up renewable energy and energy access, when the countries are suffering from or countries are facing a huge crisis in terms of the financial needs for debt services. So that is one. Maybe we may all take 1 minute each and try and maybe we can discuss this. Mr. Sahil, if you can hear me, if you could just.
Okay, thanks, Jay. Yeah, actually, the problem is multifaceted, and the solution has also to be multifaceted. There is no single solution or a silver bullet that will solve all the financing problems. So we need climate finance. It has been a disappointment, by the way. We have had, for example, a number of climate facilities, climate-related facilities available globally, like the GEF and the GCF. But Africa has actually been the continent that has used the least compared to other geographies for all those climate finances that were available. They were intrinsically very complex and difficult to access. So historically, we haven't had a very good track record in terms of accessing climate finance. Yes, there are certain case stories, but in general, if you speak as a region, Sub-Saharan Africa has not benefited from climate finance to the extent it should have. Mind you, Africa has the least contribution to global climate change. Less than 2%, 2 to 3% of greenhouse gas emissions are attributable to Africans. And yet, Africa has probably, I don't have the exact figure, but it's well below 5% of usage of climate finance. So yes, we need a very different approach into how climate finance will flow into Africa. There is talk of, for example, loss and damage, a new facility about loss and damage at the upcoming COP28. Probably it will be also one of the other highlight top issues of negotiation. So we'll need new avenues of climate finance that will make the flow of finance much easier and possible, because we really need it. But it's not only climate finance that we should be depending upon. We should also work with partners in terms of making available concessional finance, be it climate or be it from, say, the multilateral development banks, from the development bank, development finance institutions and bilaterals, to actually leverage more private finance. So we have to start replicating some good stories coming out from certain case stories. I mean, there is full of literature about specific application of blended finance and different forms of leveraging to gain access to private finance. You know, by some estimates, for example, I was reading a report recently, 2 days ago, a new report was published, and for every concessional or public finance available needs to leverage something like 8 to 9 times more private finance. Currently, it is at best 1-to-1. You know, especially in Sub-Saharan Africa, I mean, if you want, for example, to do business, I don't know specifically was a Nigeria case, but in many other African countries, in rural areas, small mini grids and other distributed renewable energy business, they depend almost, well, not exclusively, but very highly on available to grant and concessional finance. So achieving that 1-to-10 or 1-to-8, 1-to-9 kind of ratio is very important, but that one also depends a lot on how things are structured locally on the ground. As I said earlier, close to 2 dozen African countries are post-conflict or very fragile still. So it will be very difficult actually to get any kind of private finance at scale flowing into those geographies anytime in the next 3, 4, 5 years. So those countries will have to be targeted by grant and very concessional financing from the rest of the world. But those countries that are better positioned to tweak their regulatory frameworks and make sure, I mean, creates a degree of predictability for contracts, etc. And those countries that can actually reasonably make progress in terms of revision of, I mean, in terms of mobilizing local finance, local financial resources. There is some close to some $2 trillion USD worth of finance sitting in African pension funds, for example, but they haven't invested at all in the energy system to date, for example. So those countries that have some degree of opportunity to mobilize that kind of local resource also need to step up and share the burden of those other countries that are completely going to be dependent on grants and highly concessional finance. So it's multifaceted. There is a complex and very difficult negotiations that are currently going on. It will probably not see this kind of the new levels of financing flowing into Africa in the next couple of years. But we need to make sure that we need to set the ground so that the second half of this decade actually is the time when when we'll be having sufficient finance available so that we can ramp up our implementation of projects. Thanks.
Thank you so much. So we have one question each from the participants, from Mr. Olu and Ms. Tamiksha. So this is for a more high-level kind of question for Tamiksha. And interesting as well is, how will Africa's recent entry into G20 and BRICS will help it with raising more international climate finance? So Tamiksha, if you may want to answer.
Sure. So firstly, I don't know much on G20 processes, but why these kind of memberships are important and how they could be helpful is that because all these countries who actually are supposed to be, like we were mentioning how climate finance is not flowing at all, the ones who are responsible for making it flow are part of the, not the BRICS, but the G20 at least. And that is a point, it's a good platform to raise the concerns, to show areas where the impact can be made, and to form some sort of networks or coalitions to enable that. The work packages there do move slowly, but they move finally, in the sense that there would be some kind of a framework required to be made, some policy changes that have to be agreed to, and then finally it would translate to something. It would be slow, and I don't think it's at the speed that is required, but it is an area where some kind of further discussions can be done with the people who are most relevant for this topic. With the BRICS, I think the idea is to just to join together and have this perspective as what we call Global South, or however we want to name that can actually talk about knowledge sharing, facilitative partnerships that could work across these. So directly, it would not really lead to climate finance flows, but it could lead to a lot of knowledge sharing, information sharing, network formations that I believe would be very helpful.
It is going to help in one way or the other, definitely. Yes. So yes, the other question is for Mr. Olu. Uh, he wants to know, are there clear policies on private sector participation in mini grid development, which deals with financing and tariffs? How do you manage them when eventually connected to the main grid?
So I think Danladi has asked this question. Danladi, I think maybe you are Nigerian, but Nigeria's mini grid regulations of 2016 is one of the best in the world. It is clear on what should happen with tariffs. It is also clear on what should happen when the main grid comes. That regulation, however, I have with a caveat that it is still young and maybe not largely tested. But what needs to happen at each point is clear in terms of tariffs and how to ensure that tariffs are cost reflective for many grids, and in terms of what should happen with grids, that also is very clear in the regulation. So in terms of, but however, something to also notice that in a lot of these areas, will the main grid come? That is the question that we need to ask. The outlook or the simple answer over the next few years is that the main grid may not largely come. So those risks are not there, which is why issues around or conversations around decentralization is now front burner in places like Nigeria and other African countries, because it is clear to every most stakeholders that the main grid and extending it is not the right way to go. Rather, decentralization and mini grids is the right way to go. In Nigeria, for instance, over the last 2 weeks, we had two failures of our national grid, resulting in a total blackout, because it is a central grid that is maybe a very, very, very difficult to handle or manage. But with decentralization and mini grids, it is much easier to manage smaller units in various locations. So the regulations, and the simple answer is yes, the regulations are clear. India is a more advanced market, and a lot of things that, permit me to say Nigeria is also doing has borrowed from more advanced market like India. For instance, the regulations are typical, So India, being a more advanced market, already has these mechanisms in place. Nigeria now also has regulations in place to support tariffing for cost-reflective tariffs, and also what happens when eventually the main grid then comes. Would that happen? That is another question. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Olu. Thank you so much. So I think with that we come. So the questioner has said, I am a Ghanaian. He's from Ghana. Yes, the person who asked this question particularly to Mr. Olu. He's from Ghana. So yeah, we all can see there is immense interest in the African region, especially in the Sub-Saharan region, in terms of DRE, in terms of overall enhancing energy access. But yes, there are challenges, of course, and not just simple challenges, multifaceted, very formidable challenges in terms of finances, in terms of knowledge transfer, in terms of technology may not be presenting that kind of a challenge, but yes, other areas are. And affordability is one key challenge, of the domestic consumers, even for the commercial and industrial consumers. Absence of grid network in most of the countries, throughout the country, is another issue. So all these, yes, and all these in a nutshell present a really formidable challenge and requires everybody to work together and to seek a solution to address this kind of situation. And I would also like to mention that we, as part of our programs, routine programs, we conduct all these webinars and every month, and we may also conduct it twice a month. But yes, for now we are doing it every month, and we also continuously do capacity building and trainings and research and publications. So we have been encouraging our friends from Africa to register in our training programs. One such training program is coming up in November on compressed biogas. So basically, if people are there who are interested and they can register, to come to attend this training program that we organize on site. It is a residential program. So I would request everybody to register well in advance so that we have enough time to seek approvals from the government and everything for visa processing. So if there are people who are interested to attend, please do so by registering at the earliest. So with this, I really want to thank everyone. Vineet, thank you so much. Mr. Olu, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much.
How
Thank you.
difficult it is to manage time, and Mr. Saile, thanks for being to speak to our webinar, and we'll reach out to you, all of you, for the programs and works and similar kind of events. And last but not the least, Mr. Meeksha, thank you so much for your enriching insights, and we'll definitely come and see you in our office to understand more about Africa and how we all can work together. And with this, I would really like to thank everyone, all the participants, although we didn't have many. But yes, let's look forward to increase. As Mr. Olu said, they have the ambitious target of reaching to 500 sites. We are also having ambitious target to reach the audience from Sub-Saharan Africa to 1,000 in our next webinar. So yes, so these are the platforms, which provide us opportunity to interact with you all and with the participants. And with this, once again, I thank you all for your time. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you very
so
much.
Thank
Thanks
you.
for the opportunity.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much. And thanks to all the participants.